back then you didn't go online and buy tickets. Back then you had to stand in line in front of a ticket shop and buy the tickets there. And they opened the ticket shop at 9 o'clock. But I remember with important shows, there were always lines early on. So I went there in the middle of the week at 6 o'clock, I think, and I stood in front of the mall, and then they opened the door of the mall. I ran through the mall to the ticket shop, and I sat on the floor. I was the third one in row in line for them to open 3 hours later. I was sitting on the floor, and there were newspaper people, and they took photographs and asked us what we were doing there. And I got my tickets, and I came home very proud. And the next day I had to go to school and tell my teacher why I wasn't there, because I skipped school. And I said, well, I'm 18 years old now, and there are two ways we can handle this. Either I write a note which says I had a headache and I sign it myself, which I'm allowed to do because I'm 18 years old, or I'll just tell you the truth. And I pulled out that newspaper article, put that on the table with my photo in it. And I said, well, you can decide. And he said, give me a pen. And he signed that newspaper article, as a teacher does when he gets a note that you were sick. So he said, okay, this is accepted. And that was it. I said, this is the right guy.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Set Lusting Bruce, your podcast all about Bruce Springsteen, his music, and mostly his fans. I am your host, Jesse Jackson. Joining me today, all the way from Berlin, a fellow podcaster, my new friend, Dennis, joins me. Hey, Dennis, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for letting me invite myself.
Oh, no, I'm glad. So,
it happens.
Yeah, tell us a little about yourself.
Well, first of all, I'm a fan of your podcast. Let me start that way. Full disclosure, I just wrote Jesse and said, well, I love your podcast. I just would really like if you had invited me. And he said, yes. So thank you very much for letting me do that. And I really enjoyed listening to you. Now I'm actually here seeing you, which is really a great pleasure. Who am I? That's a very complicated question. There's a long answer, and there's a medium-sized answer, and a short answer. I think we try something in between short and medium. I think that should
sounds good. No, as I've talked to other people, they apologize. I'm gone off on a tangent. And I'm like, no. We're all about tangents on my show. I love conversation.
Well, I'm a podcaster. I live for tangents. That's the whole concept of my podcast endeavors, is just to talk, and as long as it's fun.
Exactly. No, well said.
Well, let me try to get things in order. Well, first of all, I'm a dad. Second of all, I'm a husband. I hope my wife agrees with that order of things. I just sent my little son to bed with a nice story of a choo-choo train, and now he's sleeping, and I'm here to talk to you in Dallas. Otherwise, I've got a job. I'm a VP of a political consultant agency. We do other things too, but we mainly do political consulting. In my spare time, which is where the stuff happens, which I would really come up with when you ask me, who am I? The other thing is my job, which I love, and I'm probably good at it. But the other part is, who are you? That question, the difficult one. That's basically a long list of things I do. It's I'm an author, I'm a podcaster, I'm a photographer, I'm a YouTuber, I'm a rock star who never was. So when I was young, I dreamt of strapping on that guitar, that Telecaster, and becoming Bruce Springsteen, and that didn't happen. So I have to do everything in between. Basically, that's the medium-sized answer. Jesse, I can't hear you.
Your day gig sounds interesting. Do you just work with politicians, companies? What do you do?
We mostly work with one party in Germany, which is probably the sister party of your Democrats over there.
Okay.
The German Social Democratic Party. That's we actually belong to them. They have a few different companies that belong to them, and we are one of those. And we do lots of different causes with trade unions and all kinds of organizations in the leftish, medium to mid to leftish spectrum. And we also have different companies who work with us who don't really care about any politics. They just want to hire us as a communications agency, or we produce podcasts and we do produce magazines and all sorts of publications. But our main gig is helping our mother, basically the Social Democratic Party, win elections. And we just did.
Oh, well, that's good news.
So they're still working on the coalition, but the general election was just a great success, a very surprising success. And in Mecklenburg-Vorpommern, which is a state government, we just made sure that the incumbent stayed in office.
Well, good. I know it's a crazy time politically across the world. I mean, not just I know we feel it's a crazy time in the US, but then when I see the news talking about, Europe and other countries, it is a crazy time for everyone. COVID has just been just something that we don't seem to be able to get out of, and it's scary for me as a normal citizen, and it doesn't feel at times that my elected officials seem to want to hear what I have to say.
Yeah, you're in Texas, right? So
I am in Texas.
I gather you have one of those governors who's not really listening to the
exact science. Yes.
Is that diplomatically enough for someone?
Yes, no, that's very well. I tend to be more on your side of the agenda, and most of the elected officials in Texas tend to be on the other side. To be very, very conservative and very, very strongly into the Republican Party. And what really bothers me, Dennis, and I promise we'll get off politics in a minute, but at least in the U.S., it has started being us against you versus, hey, we both want the same goals. We just disagree how to get them. Like we want in the US, for example, we want everyone to have health care, but we just disagree how to do that. Instead, it's no, you're a horrible person because you want to spend money on infrastructure versus, well, you're a horrible person because you don't want to spend money on infrastructure. And it's very fractured.
Yeah. I lived in America for a year in 1992. So basically, okay. I was able to pretend to elect Bill Clinton to office when I was in high school. We had these fake elections, and Ross Perot won, I think, in my high school in West Virginia. So I know what you mean, and there's a certain trend, and there's this saying: when America catches a cold, sneezes, everybody else catches a cold. Basically, that's I think that's how the saying goes, and that's probably true. Lots of the things you describe, you can see in Europe as well. We have the Brexit in Britain. That's where my family comes from, and I look at that and I just shake my head and say, "What happened to Great Britain? That can't be the country where my dad's from. I don't know what's going on there."
Yeah.
And you see that in Eastern Europe a lot. You see that across Europe basically, and in Germany we have parties who act basically like copycats of the Trumpian version of the Republicans. And besides those, everybody else in the German parliament could be running for office in America as a Democrat. That's a funny thing about. We do have left and right parties. We have the Christian Democrats who are very conservative. But if you look at the Democratic spectrum over there, they're still on the Democratic spectrum, which is interesting. I think Germany has learned one thing after World War II, which is try to stay in the middle, work on consensus, and then you won't get into much trouble. Basically, it was one of the things we learned from you guys after World War II. And there are big factions of people who try to scrape away at that consensus. There are people who tell you that wearing a mask is like totalitarian regime coming to get you. and there are people who they started with the euro was a bad idea because then the German mark, the very important currency, was gone, and Europe would run Germany, and very strange kinds of concepts. But they keep getting traction. And if you look at what they're doing, they're copying a lot of the things that the Trumpian Republican Party did. And as you probably gathered, I'm probably very clear that I'm more on the Democratic spectrum. But
yes, absolutely, as am I.
A real Republican Party, from what I understood originally, does not exist anymore, as far as I can see from over here.
And I tend to agree. And I also, listening to former for current Republican leaders and former Republican leaders who were all about smaller government, a strong national defense, giving as much point to the local governments as well, has changed to this very almost judgmental hypocrisy of, I want to tell you how to live. They have become very, very, there are certain milestone beliefs that about a woman's right to choose, or currently we're fighting a lot of rules that are very clearly trying to stop people from voting versus, everyone should want to vote. That should not be a controversy. Wearing a mask should not be controversial. Giving everyone access to rights should not be controversial, but it is, and it's a sad thing, I think, at least in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely agree. But I think with an eye or ear to our listeners, maybe we should. What is that? What they say? Shut up and sing. Is that what
yes,
we're
exactly?
supposed to do?
That's exactly what Dennis. I was exactly what you were going to say, Dennis. Talk about growing up. So, where did you grow up, and what kind of music did your family listen to?
Okay, otherwise I could just talk about the song growing up, which is also good for an hour.
Yes, we could do that too. We could talk about. Yes, we could.
But the original question, I grew up in Hamburg, in the northern part of Germany. I moved to Berlin when I was around 30 or 35, I think, for my job. But otherwise, I'm from Hamburg, and I still feel like I'm from there. I'm just living here while I have to. Basically, that's strong roots. My dad's from England. My mom's from Hamburg, and they met when they were young, and they stayed. I think my dad left England when he was around 19 or something. I went to Hamburg and met my mother and stayed there. And he brought the Beatles with him, I guess. That's in a suitcase. And the Beatles also started in Hamburg. So there's definitely a strong connection. My mom's also a Beatles fan, not as hardcore as my dad used to be. She was more like a casual fan, but she knew all the songs, and she loved Paul McCartney. And there's also a huge amount of music that was in my family. Back then, there was like the German rock stars like Peter Maffay and Udo Lindenberg and people like that, who I always thought, well, as long as I can see Bruce, I have to look at what these guys are doing, and just kind of on a German scale, that's probably the closest we have to like real icons. There are a lot of pop stars and a lot of people who are very well known, but if you just look at the really top tier, there are just 2 or 3 up there. And those were the ones my parents let me listen to, and what they listened to. Maybe added some left-leaning children's music. There's some really fun stuff when you look at it now. It's weird. It's fun. It's on the right track, but it's a little too easy answers for a very complicated world. But lots of pacifism and lots of social justice issues, and play with not with the right kids, but with the real kids, not the ones they tell you to play with, but with your real friends.
Sure.
Music like that. Basically, that's what my mother especially gave me.
So Dennis, you mentioned, and I wondered about that. Is there a sense of pride among fans of the Beatles that, over and over people talk about, like the Malcolm Gladwell talking about that them playing those hours of in the German clubs is what helped that crucible them grow into being the Beatles. Is there a sense of pride about that among musicians or music fans there in Hamburg and in Germany?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's probably an age thing too. I think that the
Sure.
kids don't really. Well, I think whoever listens to the Beatles says, "Well, this is good music." I think
Right.
you wouldn't find anyone who says, "What's this?"
Right.
But the real fans and the people who really have a connection with them, they probably, I would venture a guess, would probably start maybe 35 upwards. Those
Yeah.
maybe, and when you're in Hamburg and you walk across the Reeperbahn and then you walk into the Große Freiheit, which is one of the little side streets, and there was a club there, the Star Club. That's where the Beatles played when they're I don't know 20 or something, very young. And when you walk across those streets, you think this is weird. They're playing. There's prostitution, there's drugs, there's alcohol, there's clubs, there's everything, and right in the middle are these cut boys from Liverpool. And now you look back at them and say, well, they weren't that clean cut. They may have been wearing suits later on, but at that
Yes.
time, they've been wearing leather jackets and they were probably having lots of fun around the clubs and didn't tell anyone about that.
No, I can imagine that they was to use a really bad analogy, right? They're at Disneyland, right? They're
Yeah.
they're England. All of a sudden, they're at this, they're everywhere where there's everything, every vice available, and at the same time playing music and just loving to play the music. A few years ago, my buddy who does the Doctor Who podcast with me and I, for fun, we picked the 5 shows we would go to if we had a time machine. And one of them I picked was to go see the Beatles in that, somewhere in those early days in Germany, because I think that would be fascinating to see, knowing them. The same thing I wish that I would love to go see Bruce like in Houston, Texas, which is only, 3 hours from where I grew up, in the middle 70s, right? Just where he would have been outside his element, but still trying to work his shows. I think that would be fascinating to see that.
Is that where we play seeds? Is that what?
Yes, exactly. That's where it came from. Yeah. Well. So
yes.
as you start getting older, your teenage years, your university years, what kind of music were you listening to, and when did Bruce enter the picture?
Well, there are basically 3 big parts. The first part was Elvis. When I was a wee lad, as my nana would call me. Elvis was everything. That was I had these
Sure.
at my tapes. Hound Dog and Jailhouse Rock was. I remember dancing to Jailhouse Rock in my elementary school. The gym was closed for renovations, and we had to move into a music room and do some exercises there. And they didn't know what to do with us, so they put on some music and let us dance to Jailhouse Rock, and we sweated more than we ever did.
Oh
so
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
so that's where everything started basically. And the second part was Michael Jackson. I think there's not a kid in the world my age who hasn't had a love affair with that music and that myth and the magical. Everything about it wasn't that just that person. There was much more. There was was like watching a Disney movie. You could actually enter it and stay there in that headspace, and there was so much fantasy and magic and pretending to be Michael Jackson, dancing around and wearing one glove to school and all that.
Sure.
And after that came Bruce. Pretty much when in 1988 or 89, I just asked my friend this morning whose fault it is, when exactly that moment was. And he wasn't quite sure. It was 88 or 89. And that happened in my high school. There was a student concert, and there's always these, the 5th graders have their little xylophones and they start singing and they do all these, every group and every age group has a certain time slot to fill. And they're the good ones, and they're the bad ones, and they're the ones where just the parents think it's great. And at the end of those school concerts, there was always one slot for a band, for a rock band from the school to play. And there was one band called the Better Straits with the singer Markus Siebert. And they walked on stage after we had suffered through 1.5 hours of every Beatles cover you could imagine, and California Dreaming sung by the school choir and all that. And in the end, there was just one band, and those folks walked up on stage. And I am very sure that they thought they were playing a stadium because they rocked the house. It was amazing. The guy was wearing a bandana, a t-shirt, and tight-fitting jeans, and had his guitar slung very low. I remember that very, very clearly, how low the guitar was. And they played 4 songs, and I loved every one of it. Now I know that they were all Springsteen songs, but I didn't know the songs. And
Right.
when it came to the encore, which was very unusual because we're not allowed to play encores at that school concert, but they just did because they were a rock band and they were the last on the bill, so that's what they did.
Yeah.
And they played Born USA. And in my German high school back in the late 80s, young me stood on the folding chairs with everybody else, and we screamed our lungs out, singing Born the USA. We were clapping our hands so hard, we were screaming, we were sweating. It was amazing what happened in that room. And afterwards, I turned to my parents, what the hell was that? I've never heard this music. What was that? And they said, well, that's Bruce Springsteen. I said, how was that not in my life before? Where was that? And we asked friends of my dad's who had a good record collection. He said, yeah, I've got some Springsteen stuff. I'll make you a mixtape. And I didn't get a mixtape. I got one side with Born the USA, and the flip side was Tunnel of Love. The Born the USA side was written with the blue pencil, with a blue pen and a red marker on it. So like a text marker. And the other side was Tunnel of Love marked with blue and blue. And I remember that tape. I carried that around forever. I listened to it back to front and front to back. And that was actually how the whole thing started. And thanks to Markus with his band. And I just didn't listen to the music. I wanted to be that. I said, I want a guitar. I want to sing. I want to write. I want to do all that stuff. Not Bruce. I wanted to be Markus, because that's the guy I saw playing that music. And after a while, I figured out, well, Markus was a nice guy and he's really good, but there's actually someone called Bruce, and that's actually the one I wanted to be. So that took me all through high school with my bands, school bands, and most of my college years. And in the end, most school bands, they finally settle into adult life, and then they have the guitar in the corner and say, well, now I could actually afford the good guitar.
Yes.
But I don't have a band anymore. I don't have time. And people would look at me funny if I just jump up and down and scream my head off. So you kind of move away from that. And that's always a little bit of pain that stays with you because you never actually went all the way. And when my son was born 3 years ago, we watched pretty much closely afterwards. There was the Broadway show. And we watched that on Netflix. And we don't really watch television with them if we can. First 2.5 years, we didn't watch any television. But with that was an exception. I sat him on my lap and said, just look at this. He had no idea what I was talking about, but he was looking at the guy with the guitar. And I said, Daddy wanted to be that. That was the first choice. Everything else is plan B. Plan B is fine, but that's the thing. So he got the truth right there. And let's see what happens with him. Maybe he will be the one picking up the guitar again later.
Right. I think both Little Steven and Bruce have talked about the numbers of how many people get a guitar and how many then a fewer amount of people actually learn how to play it, then a fewer amount start a band. And and you go through to 1 out of whatever 1,000, 10,000, whatever number to be, actually reaches a point where they can make a living at it, much less be as successful as Bruce has been or other artists. So yeah, I get that, right? But you also, I think of the line of, and the wish all the things that guitar has brought us, right? So I assume also, Dennis, that there has been that joy and that satisfaction in your life by learning that guitar and having that dream and still picking up and playing for it. I assume you play for your kids.
Sure. Just did that today.
Yes, that's great. That is awesome.
Yeah.
You're very, it's interesting that your first exposure was a Springsteen cover band. You know, I'm sure you know the story that we talk a lot about here, that often seeing Bruce live is what moves you to a different level. And yours, it was a copy of Bruce live, but it still was the same thing. Can you articulate what about that music spoke to you so much and made you go, oh my, yeah, that's it. This is what I've been looking for?
Well, I think a few of your guests have all quoted John Landau, and made me listen to music for the very first time, or something like that. Made me feel like I was listening to music for the very first time. I think that's
right.
The quote. And that was it. That was basically it. Before that, I loved. Well, maybe there was something with the Jailhouse Rock experience. I think that's pretty close, because there was something which was very bodily. That grabbed you by the lapel and shook you, basically. It said, well, now you're all shook up, basically.
Yes.
So that's what happened. And in that auditorium, I could actually feel that music kick me in the gut and said, now listen, this is important. This is not some kind of school band. These are not the best musicians of the school or whatever. There are no 5-minute guitar solos. This is just important. And that was the bodily part first. And then I started listening to what Bruce was singing, and diving more into the lyric side, and discovering so much more than just that. But first, it was definitely the let's dance and be loud part. And then I moved over to the Dylan-inspired social commentary, the deep feelings which were there, all this stuff he probably didn't even know he was doing at the time, because I'm pretty sure that he looks back at his own catalog and says, "How the hell did I write that at 20-something?"
Yeah, exactly.
This is no way that a young guy can write this stuff, but somehow he did. And that's how I discovered it too. And every time I listen to it, I rediscover it. And I'm really surprised when I dive into an old album and say, I knew this was here, but why didn't I catch this earlier? So the Springsteen discovery is maybe a process which never ends. Maybe that's what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I think of that line in the Letter to You documentary, right, where Dylan had said, if this guy's not careful, he's going to run out of words in the dictionary, right? So
he tried.
Yes, he did try. So you've got that cassette. It's got the 2 albums on it. Did you go out and try to explore and find other, like his other albums, and discovers this is the late 80s, so early 90s. So this is when, you know, a lot of fans call the dark period, right? Where he's broken up with the E Street Band. He's not doing as much. So were you going and exploring like Darkness and Letters and other stuff? Readings?
Yeah, but not in that order. I jumped around a lot. I think I don't, probably there was no internet. I probably didn't pull up Bruce Springsteen something and looked at it and said, well, okay, this is the order I'm supposed to listen to it. I just grabbed everything the record store had, started with the lower prices. There was a marketing thing called Nice Price in Germany, which they stuck on everything they couldn't sell. And so I bought Asbury Park, and I bought the E Street Shuffle. I think that's what the next albums I bought. Listened to that, loved Asbury Park, didn't love E Street Shuffle. That's something I discovered much later, that I really liked that album, but back then I didn't. Also listened to that on tape, especially when I was on my way to school. I copied the album onto tape and then listened to it on my Walkman. And then came the early 90s, which I really loved, because now I knew Springsteen and there was new music coming out. and not just one album, but two. And I remember how excited I was, what kind of rush of adrenaline it was when I listened to Human Touch for the very first time. I watched it on MTV. I looked at it and said, well, I just discovered this guy, and now there's something new. And I'm one of the people who listen to this fresh. I'm not in the recycling bin digging for cheap records. I'm here for the new stuff. And I love both albums. I have a favorite. I of course, it's Lucky Town grabbed me as a rocker more than the other one, which is fine. There's a lot of people looking down on it, but I think it's a brilliant album. There's too much gloss on it. It's a bit too sparkly, but those were the 90s. That's what you did in a studio, especially when you went and didn't have your band with you, but a producer, and they brought in the best musicians, and that's just what they did.
Yes.
And I don't think there's any record in the beginning of the 90s which sounds better than this.
Yes.
I just love the albums, and I know why I like no, what's it? What did I say? The Lucky Town. Oh, my brain.
That's all right. No, you're good.
Yeah. You can leave that in. That album, you can hear how fast it was recorded, and I think that's one of the magic things that also happens with when you listen to Letter to You, because you feel the energy of this just needs to be recorded now.
Yes.
Don't mess with it. Just these songs are important. Let's hit them, count them in, and let's see what happens, and then put it out. It's good. It's really good. And whatever you do to it later would not help the songs, but would actually be counterproductive. And then that was the time when I was in America. And then when I went to West Virginia, and I thought, now I'm going to America. And everybody there is a Springsteen fan. And I was like getting on the plane. Everybody there would probably be wearing bandanas and singing Born to Say all day long. And everybody looked at me and said, what, Springsteen? Really? No, we moved on. That's been a while. So everybody in my high school was into Metallica and Guns N' Roses and Garth Brooks. Basically, we had those three groups in high school. Two of them talked with each other sometimes, and the other group didn't talk to anyone else. And I was in the middle. I said, well, Springsteen does everything. There's country, there's rock, there's everything in there. Why don't you just listen to Springsteen? It's easier.
Yeah.
But nobody listened to me.
Why did you come to the US for a year? What happened? Why was that a journey that you went on?
There was a high school exchange program. They sent me to high school for my senior year in Gilmer County High School. Go Titans! So shout out to those nice people.
Yes.
And it was amazing because I had that picture in my head of Springsteen America.
Sure.
I wasn't looking for New York City or LA. I was looking for New Jersey.
Yes.
And West Virginia, I know, looks different, but it feels a lot like that. A lot of people who are very honest. They tell you how they see it. They work hard. They're not most of them are pretty poor. There's not a lot of money in West Virginia. Few families have all of it, and the rest work for those 2 or 3 families. That's at least how I saw it back then. And I said, well, this music should explain your life to you guys. This is exactly what your lives are about. And they were more like, well, yes, maybe, but I don't want to hear it. I want to numb my feelings with hard rock. I want to escape all this, or I want to paint a picture of pretty girls and cowboys.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So I want to do friends at low places. Yes, I do too. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's interesting. So becoming a fan at that time period, he's not touring, and as you well know, since you were kind enough to say sweet things about the podcast, I always preface this with the amount of times you've seen Bruce is not a fair barometer of how big of a fan you are. But Dennis, have you gotten to see him live? And if so, how many times?
I tried counting, and I actually came up with the number 6. I'm not quite sure if that's accurate, if it's 5 or 7, but I tried a couple of times. I listened to more of your podcasts than I saw Springsteen live. So that goes for you.
Thank you. That's very sweet of you. Yes.
And yeah, the first show I saw was the Tom Joad tour. Actually, I came back
Okay.
from America and went back to school, and then there was this record release, and I said, "Well, what's this? This is totally different. Where did that come from?" By then, I was really listening to for the lyrics, not just the music. And I said, "Wow, these are really cool stories. Those are like mini movies." And then they said, well, Springsteen is coming to Hamburg. He's going to play in the CCH, which is the Congress Center, which was actually the same place where he played in Germany for the very first time. He played in that venue. And I said, well, I've got to go there. But this is so small. Doesn't he play like arenas and stadiums? And what's going on? I said, no, that he's just touring on this album, and it's going to be smaller. And it's going to be very hard to get tickets. So I was panicking. I said, well, now I know Springsteen. I'm fallen in love with him. I fought for him in America. Nobody listened to me, but I'm the
Yes.
evangelical Springsteen fan, basically.
Right.
And now he's coming, and you're telling me it's going to be hard to get tickets. What will happen if I don't get one? I was really looking down into the abyss there.
Yes,
So
I know. I can imagine, right?
really
Like,
panicking.
oh no.
Yeah.
I mean,
And,
he's in my town and I'm not
yes.
seeing him. No.
I was really panicking. And back then, you didn't go online and buy tickets. Back then, you had to stand in line in front of a ticket shop and buy the tickets there. And they opened the ticket shop at 9 o'clock. But I remember with important shows, there were always lines early on. So I went there in the middle of the week at 6 o'clock, I think. And I stood in front of the mall, and then they opened the door of the mall. I ran through the mall to the ticket shop, and I sat on the floor. I was the third one in row in line for them to open 3 hours later. I was sitting on the floor, and there were newspaper people, and they took photographs and asked us what we were doing there. And I got my tickets, and I came home very proud. And next day I had to go to school and tell my teacher why I wasn't there, because I skipped school. And I said, well, I'm 18 years old now, and there are two ways we can handle this. Either I write a note which says I had a headache and I sign it myself, which I'm allowed to do because I'm 18 years old, or I'll just tell you the truth. And I pulled out that newspaper article, put that on the table with my photo in it. And I said, well, you can decide. And he said, give me a pen. And he signed that newspaper article, as a teacher does when he gets a note that you were sick. So he said, okay, this is accepted. And that was it. I said, this is the right guy.
I love that story so much. That is greatness. That is wonderful.
It really is.
Yeah, that's a cool teacher.
That was my music teacher, Klaus Schrickel. Shout out to him. And he was the one who actually let me play with my band in off hours at school. I could use the rooms and the equipment and everything. So he was really a great influence there.
Talk about that first show, the excitement of you going. I'm sure you were just nervous and anxious and just all kinds of emotions going on.
Yeah. Back in a little later in university, I wrote an essay about this experience. I couldn't find it anymore, but the premise was that I was too excited, looking forward to the memory of it, to really enjoy it. I was sitting there, said I wanted to come home and tell people that I was there. I wanted to share everything with them instead of just sitting there and enjoying it. So what I did, I got my little dictaphone out. You remember these little tape recorders, tiny ones with the tiny mini cassettes in it, which you used at the office for like memos and letters and stuff. And I had one of those. I took that to the show, put my finger on the little red LED or whatever that little light bulb was, and I pressed a record, and I held that to my side so nobody could see it. And I recorded the whole show, and I kept looking at the little light, just hoping that no one would see that little red light blinking. And at the end, I just put that away. And when the last 2 or 3 songs, we were able to rush the stage. Everybody was supposed to sit there and be quiet. I think at one point you just said, shut
Yeah.
because this is not one of those shows. This is a different kind. You can bleep me if you want, but otherwise that's just a quote from the boss.
Okay.
So.
Yes, exactly.
And because people started clapping and said, no, you're going to mess these things up. This is not about that. This is something different. And in the end, he just opened it up and played a few songs. Everybody just rushed the stage and sang along and danced. And I was standing in the aisle, maybe 10 feet away from him. And at that moment, I just had no idea what I was seeing. I did not register what I was seeing. That was over so fast that I didn't really enjoy it. I enjoy the memory of standing there and telling the story, but at that moment, it was so surreal that I was actually standing there. That's something that I tried to make up for when I was at a club concert of John Bon Jovi when he did his solo stuff. And I was able to play in a club. I was going to a club where he played with his band. And I was actually standing from the stage. I looked at his boots and I could see that his heels were scruffed and that he didn't wear the new boots. He just wore the old ones because they were comfortable. And I looked at every detail on stage. When he dropped a pick, I said, well, maybe I could get that later or something. And that's where I actually tried to recreate that memory. But pretty close. It's New Jersey, but it's not the boss. But at that moment with Bruce, there was just too much, basically, for my emotions to really register everything. But and the tape is terrible. I still have it in my cupboard. You can see behind me. There's a big suitcase with lots of Springsteen tapes in there, and it's not one of those illegal things you sell online. It's just my little terrible recording, and I don't even have a dictaphone, so I have to buy one on eBay sooner or later. But it's still there.
And I think that's a great example of. We often talk about trying to be present, right? Like where you're worrying about recording stuff or taking photos and just instead stopping and enjoying the moment. I think that's really good advice for whether it's a concert, whether it's a sporting activity, whether it's dinner with your family, that too often we're not enjoying the moment. And I think that's one of the reasons why Better Days is one of my favorite songs, because I think in a lot of ways, that's what that song's about, is enjoying the journey. So I think that's interesting that the young you was looking back at it, you enjoyed it, but you could have been more in the moment.
Yeah, later with other Springsteen shows, I was more able to do that. But at that moment, it was just a little bit too much, I guess.
Sure, no, that makes sense. So talk about some of the other shows you've gone to. Any stories you want to share? Where have most of them been in Germany, or have you gone through Europe to see them? Talk a little bit about that.
Basically, just Hamburg and Berlin.
Okay.
The second show I saw was that reunion show, and they didn't come to Hamburg back then with the E Street Band, but they went to Berlin. And I told my parents, whatever happens, this guy is coming. We all agree he's the best, but now he's actually bringing the E Street Band. No offense to the other band, which were fine musicians.
Yes,
but this
absolutely.
is Clarence Clemens and Nils Lofgren and all those. I need to go there. And I said, well, we need to go there too. So what we did, we got my parents had a camper van back then, and we got my whole band and my parents, and we all hopped into the camper van and drove. Now it's 3 hours. Back then with that old bus, that probably was like 5 hours or 4.5 from Hamburg to Berlin, back in the eastern part of Germany, of east. Well, it's go due east, and then the eastern part of Berlin. It was already, of course, one city, but it was still the eastern part of Berlin back then, in the Wuhlheide, a very beautiful concert venue, open air. It's in the middle of a forest. It's like a deep crater. Basically, you go down, and then all around you got trees, and in the evening the moon comes up over the stage. And I remember my mom also tells me, we're pretty sure that we remembered it the same way, that when he played Born to Run, the moon was coming up.
Nice.
Maybe that's a legend. I'm not quite sure, but it's a family legend, and we both agree that it's true. So
yes.
There you go. There you have it. And I was there with my band. That was the magic. I wasn't there with my parents or by myself or with my girlfriend or whatever. I was there with my band. And I was pretty sure back then that was still a possibility.
Right.
Yeah, well, you all know how that ended up. But at that moment, at that age, when you pick up a guitar and you play in a band in school, you are pretty sure that that is a real possibility, that you could actually one day stand on that stage. So I wasn't just listening to Springsteen and the band and checking out everything. I was looking at the amplifiers, I was looking at the cables, I was looking at the set list, I was looking at everything I could find and soaking up every little bit of it. And at the end of the show, I just lingered. I stayed there, and I just wanted to stay close to the stage and watch the roadies tear everything up. One of the roadies walked up to the front of the stage and just started grabbing the piece of paper stuck to the floor with the set list, and they crumpled it up and threw them in the corner. And I said, "Excuse me, could I have one of those, please?" And he said, yeah, sure. And he just threw that over to me, and I still have 2 pages of the set list from back then. I gave one of that to my my best man for my wedding.
Yes.
Niels should honor that, and I have the other one. And this is just an amazing document. It's Arial 15 on white paper, so it's nothing special.
Right.
But it has the Springsteen songs with the date on it and Berlin.
Yes.
So that's a magical piece of paper. I got that stuck in my record collection. So whenever I pull out the records, that piece of paper falls out. I'll frame that one day, but until then, it stays there. And that's what probably the most magical ones were. The other ones were great concert experiences, and it was wonderful to be there. And of course, everything is like a church service. I think that's a lot of your listeners called it a quasi-religious experience. But that's what it was. But those first 2 things, him solo and then with the E Street Band, were probably the ones that I remember most. Yeah.
Yeah. Dennis and I were having a blast talking, so we kept on recording. But I'm going to split it in 2 parts. So come back tomorrow where we talk more about his podcast and how Bruce has inspired him to try to do great things. See you tomorrow. Set Listing Bruce has a Patreon page where you can offer to donate anything from $1 a month up to whatever amount you want. Thanks to the wonderful people who support the podcast through Patreon, I'm able to cover the cost of the Zoom recordings and the hosting of the podcast, putting it out, things like that. So thank you to Holly Mack, Steve Rogers, Dale Hozak, Terry Smith, Anna Lynn, Chris Bloom, Mary Thomas, Alex Samolta, Andrew Goddard, Betsy Hodges, Levi Petrie, Stephen Malio. Each of you are my Springsteen siblings. You are my angels, and I appreciate you so much. Thank you for all your support and love.
You just heard the fun talking, hard rocking, music loving, album ranking, fan thinking, joy spreading, lyric reading, story sharing podcast that is the one, the only Set Listing Bruce. The theme for Set Listing Bruce was written by David Rosen, used by permission.